Hi, I'm Dr. Gavin Davis, and in this video I want to talk about Beowulf, a translation and commentary by J.R.R. Tolkien, together with Sellic Spell, edited by Christopher Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien is a renowned scholar in Beowulf Studies, to the point that no review of Beowulf criticism would be complete without mentioning the impact Tolkien had on this poem's critical history. As somebody who has a deep love of The Lord of the Rings, as well as professional credentials in Tolkien's academic field, you can imagine my excitement when, so many years ago, I saw this hit the shelves for the first time. Beowulf and Tolkien? Two great tastes that taste great together. The original dream team. So why isn't this the definitive new edition of Beowulf? This compilation of Tolkien's work on Beowulf does a magnificent job bridging the gap between Tolkien's scholarly work and his fiction. At the same time, it would be really easy to mistake this translation for something it is not. Let's cut to the chase. This translation is not the most authoritative version of Beowulf, and it's probably not even the best. But that's okay, because neither J.R.R. Tolkien or Christopher Tolkien thought it was. You see, the reason Tolkien's translation was never published in his lifetime was because Tolkien never really intended it to be published. Christopher Tolkien, who edited his father's work into this book, begins the introduction by justifying why this material took so long to come to light. The translation was completed by 1926, when my father was 34. Before him lay 2 decades as the professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, 2 decades of further study of Old English poetry, together with an arduous program of lectures and classes and reflection, most especially on Beowulf. In other words, Christopher knew that this version of Beowulf isn't necessarily a reflection of his father's best work. You wouldn't want to read the papers I wrote at the beginning of my academic career, and while Tolkien's are better than anything I can and ever will write, they're not as good as what he would write later on. Additionally, unlike a work prepared and polished for a specific audience, Tolkien's translation of Beowulf was more of a living, working document that Tolkien used and referenced during his time as a professor and lecturer of Old English literature. This means that instead of one work, written and polished from beginning to end, what Tolkien had was a smattering of papers, edited copies and incomplete versions and rewrites, in addition to buckets of commentary written out in a fragmentary fashion. So, credit must be given to Christopher Tolkien, Tolkien's son who was charged with bringing so much of his father's work to light, and who was himself a successful scholar of medieval literature. Christopher had no illusions as to what his father's Beowulf was. It's not his father's best work, and the fragmentary remains of what his father left means there was going to be no great way of presenting all of it to everyone who was going to be interested. Still, as a scholar of medieval literature, Christopher has expertise in handling fragmentary manuscript records and complex transmission histories. This means that he has the skills to make educated guesses about how his father would have wanted his work to be represented. The result, then, is this. Not the newest scholarly critical edition of Beowulf, or a representation of Tolkien's best work, but a thoughtfully compiled memorial to Tolkien's relationship with Beowulf, made accessible to those of us who otherwise wouldn't have this access to Tolkien's thoughts on the subject. So how is the translation? Well, it's fine. Certainly not the best, but certainly the most Tolkien, and that has its own merits. After you get through the introduction, in which Christopher explains how he edited together this version of Beowulf from his father's notes, the poem itself is presented as lyrical prose over the next 92 pages. It's formatted in paragraphs, although line numbers are given on the side for reference in the notes. These aren't the original poem's line numbers. Here are the opening lines so you can get a gist of how it feels and sounds. Lo, the glory of the kings, of the people of the Speardanes, in days of old we have heard tell, how those princes did deeds of valor. Oft shield shaving robbed the hosts of foemen, many peoples, of the seats where they drank their mead, laid fear upon men, he who first was found forlorn. Comfort, for that he lived to know, mighty grew under heaven, throve in honor, until all that dwelt nigh about, over the sea where the whale rides, must hearken to him and yield him tribute. A good king was he. A couple things worth noting are the precision of the word choice and the somewhat confounding sentence structure and word order. Tolkien was enamored with the alliteration of Old English verse, which he often tried to incorporate into his modern English poetry. This is technically prose, but the lyrical quality elevates the style and makes it feel like you're reading bits of The Lord of the Rings, like when his writing was at its most elevated. But what's with the word order? Well, we know from Tolkien's mastery of language that this must have been a choice rather than something he happened into accidentally. And the decision here has been to maintain the original Old English ordering of words where possible, instead of reordering them to make it more sensible in modern English. For example, even though English typically follows a subject-verb-object order, like the warrior grabbed the sword, Old English frequently ends with the verb, which explains why Tolkien writes, "Lo, the glory of the kings we have heard tell." The blockiness of Tolkien's word order makes more sense if you were to see it broken into its half-lines, like it normally is in modern editions, where the representation of each line of poetry on the page helps to support the fact that these ideas are connected more by their sense and their sound rather than by their word order. Now, the medieval manuscripts themselves didn't tend to use line breaks to represent poetry, so maybe it makes sense that Tolkien would preserve the paragraph form through his verse-adjacent prose. But modern editions are more likely to choose to use a modern English word order that prioritizes a clear transmission of meaning without also trying to reproduce a verse form that can't really be replicated in modern English anyways. But again, remember, these were more Tolkien's notes on translation for his personal reference. He even said in a letter that the early version of his translation was hardly to my liking. What this gives us then is a particularly Tolkienian imagination of the world of Beowulf rather than a readable translation. But that is still interesting for those who come to Beowulf from a background in Tolkien. And some of these anomalies can shed interesting light on Tolkien's unique perspective he has on the world he was translating. For example, on line 397, Tolkien translates Yeot Machos, literally men of the Yeots, as young Yeotish knights. And a little later, he uses the word esquire as a translation for thane, a warrior retainer who serves a goblet according to his office. Now, using words like knight and esquire evokes chivalric culture, which I find honestly surprising due to its anachronism. Knightly culture in the genre of chivalric literature wouldn't be a thing until centuries after Beowulf was written, and Tolkien was well aware of this anachronism. So on the one hand, this probably isn't a great literal translation for the Old English. Sure, the word knight has been around for a long time and did originally mean man, but it doesn't carry that sense anymore. And even though early medieval English martial culture was a precursor to chivalric culture, this translation is a stretch at best and misleading at worst. But maybe in Tolkien's mind, who wouldn't have mistaken the nuances of these words and understood Beowulf to be a medieval fantasy, just maybe this was him leaning into the compression of time that occurs so often in fantasy, just as much in the Middle Ages as it does now. You know how fantasy tends to sprawl across time periods, creating a sense of timelessness in the stories and legends being told? Well, maybe this is Tolkien, representing this quality in Beowulf itself. So while this is not the best translation for accessing the medieval Beowulf, it certainly is an interesting one that gives us access to nuance about how Tolkien thought about Beowulf's world that we otherwise wouldn't get. Sussing these nuances out of the translation itself can take some work, but the notes and commentary present Tolkien's critical interpretation with clarity and directness. Christopher Tolkien pulled this commentary from the notes his father used to inform his lectures, so going through the notes is a little like getting snippets of those lectures tied to specific relevant passages from the text. This commentary, I think, is one of the most valuable parts of this book, since they highlight what Tolkien thought were some of the teachable moments from the story. So if you're a Tolkien fan, or someone who's teaching Beowulf to a class that may be more familiar with Tolkien's fantasy and are looking for entry points to a discussion of the text, this commentary is a fantastic place to start. For example, when the Beowulf poem describes Grendel's descent from the biblical figure of Cain, Tolkien's commentary on page 160 discusses the tension between the poem's Christian and pagan elements, what that has to do with the monsters, and what that means for the poem's presentation of heroism in the heathen past. These central issues of the poem are fascinating to unpack, and even though Tolkien's essay on the monsters and the critics treats with these issues in a more polished manner, this book is perhaps more accessible than that essay, since the passages are shorter and linked to specific moments in the poem that ground our analysis in the text and can be used as passages for further research or discussion. Now, while insightful, this commentary is neither thorough nor exhaustive. Christopher Tolkien noted how his father's notes kind of petered out towards the end, and that he did the best he could to represent a curated selection at the very least. But most of the commentary is front-loaded towards the beginning of the story, giving us good material to get started. And I would recommend that anyone reading this book starts with a commentary or reads it alongside Beowulf. And Christopher Tolkien helpfully provides both the line numbers of his father's translation as well as the more standard Kleber line numbers for each commentary's reference. Obviously, it would be awesome to delve into many of these subjects, but this video is getting long enough as it is, and I still want to talk about Sellic Spell. So, if you want more discussion of Tolkien's relationship with Beowulf, be sure to subscribe and to let me know in the comments below. Sellic Spell is perhaps the strangest inclusion in this book, but also perhaps the most interesting if you know what you're looking at. To understand what Sellic Spell is, you need to know that Tolkien wasn't just a professor of English, as he was a philologist by training. A philologist is a professional in the study and reconstruction of historical languages. You see, back in Tolkien's day, there was a lot of work being done on the recovery of dead and forgotten languages, and by really sophisticated methods for determining how languages change and develop over time, philologists were able to effectively reconstruct languages that we no longer have. If that sounds really difficult, it was, and Tolkien himself was actually really good at it, hence his famous skill in creating languages. But Tolkien wasn't just fascinated with lost languages, he was also fascinated with lost legends. You see, just as language has patterns in which it develops and changes over time, Tolkien believed that legends too developed according to predictable patterns as they matured from fairy tale stories to works of long poetry. Sellic Spell, or in Old English, Sellic Spell, which means strange tale, is Tolkien's imagination of what an earlier telling of the Beowulf story may have looked like before it was composed into the long poem that survives today. Sellic Spell is not a historical work or something recovered that we no longer have. It is purely Tolkien's imagination of what a historical poem could have been. Tolkien wrote a version of it in Old English, but again, this is more of a demonstration of his mastery of Old English than any kind of proof that this story is old. Sellic Spell is Tolkien's fan fiction of a medieval story, but who is more qualified to give us this kind of story? Sellic Spell is amazing. It reads like an older fairy tale, simplified in its tone and style, with basic narrative elements that make it feel timeless. There are changes to the Beowulf story as we have it in the long poem, but the changes are intentional and have relationship with the poem in a way that encourages the reader of Sellic Spell to consider Beowulf in new ways. For example, Sellic Spell makes much of how the central character, Beowulf, got his name. Now, Beowulf is just a literal translation of Beowulf's name. And what is a wolf that hunts bees? It's a bear. And in Sellic Spell, Beowulf is supernaturally raised by bears, which explains his superhuman strength and proclivity for wrestling in hand-to-hand combat. Now, this kind of insight is really cool, and you could have it explained to you by an editorial note in a more scholarly critical edition. But there's something special to having it laid out for you in narrative form. This kind of perfectly embodies what Tolkien was so gifted at, and something he did several times over the course of his career, which was to use intelligently contrived stories as teaching objects. Even if Sellic Spell doesn't exactly hold up as an academic argument, it is both profoundly beautiful as a literary object fashioned after an older mode of storytelling, as well as a teaching tool for helping us consider what kinds of lives these ancient stories may have had before they were passed down to us. Before I get to the conclusion, I do have to mention the book ends with two brief poems, which are versions of the Lay of Beowulf. These are Tolkien recasting the Beowulf legend into short little narrative poems for personal enjoyment. Fabulous short pieces that work like Tolkien's other poetry, absolutely worth a read, and I'm glad they're included in this book as a monument to Tolkien's profound creative relationship with the past. In conclusion, can you see how it would be easy to mistake this work for something it isn't? J.R.R. Tolkien was an expert on Beowulf, and this is his translation. But because Tolkien never really intended his working translation or his many lecture notes to be published, it isn't necessarily the best edition of Beowulf for most people, and it isn't necessarily representative of his authoritative intervention into Beowulf scholarship. However, Christopher Tolkien knew all this when he edited this work together. He knew it's not a scholarly monograph, and he doesn't try to market it as such. You can even tell from the cover, the selling point of this book is that it's Tolkien's Beowulf, a memorial to his work on the medieval poem that he loved so dearly. And as a memorial to Tolkien's work, this book is amazing, irreplaceable even. Christopher Tolkien was 91 years old when this work was published, and given the intimate nature of his father's love of this poetry, it is difficult to imagine a work of this nature being compiled by anyone else. Two final things. First, an authoritative representation of Tolkien's most significant contribution to Beowulf studies does exist, and it's his essay, Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, first published in 1936. I do find it a little odd that The Monsters and the Critics wasn't included in this volume, but maybe that's because of copyright issues or because the essay was already printed in a collection of Tolkien's essays. The Monsters and the Critics is amazing, not only as an academic argument, but as a piece of persuasive writing. I have a whole video dedicated to unpacking that argument in the works, so be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss it when that video comes out. Second, if you are in search of a good edition of the Beowulf poem itself, I have a recent video comparing 3 more recent editions of Beowulf that you can find on the link on the screen. And if you're interested in Tolkien's edition, my personal preferred editions, or other related works, see the affiliate links in the description below. If you use these links, you can really help out the channel as I get a little kickback at no extra cost to you. As always, thanks for joining me in this discussion. In the next few videos, I'll cover Tolkien's The Monsters and the Critics, but I also want to begin moving away from Beowulf to cover other less well-known Old English battle poems. Until then, I'm Gavin the Medievalist, and I'll see you next time.